Thank you everyone for joining today. I will be talking today about my research on housing expenditure and fertility in the United Kingdom. Just briefly, if you have any questions or comments, please send them to Claudia online, and we will have 3 points in which I will answer any questions or comments. I'm studying the period from 1992 until 2022, and just to overview, the TFR in the United Kingdom across all of the constituent countries during this time period saw a moment through the 90s when fertility was falling, before fertility sharply rose again until 2010, and since then has sharply fallen to low rates across all 3 constituent countries. The popular media in these countries have associated this sharp decline over the last decade with the cost of children. Particularly popular in the explanation within the popular media is this generation war in which millennials and younger generations are simply unable to afford their families. And they accord this to either the cost of children itself or that they're simply unavailable or unable to afford housing and have been priced out of the housing market. To have a bird's eye view of housing prices in the United Kingdom and across the world, I have a chart here showing the housing price to income ratio. We see that in 2021, the housing price to income ratio across the G7 plus Austria, so high income countries, all exceeded 100, or that the housing price exceeded income in every country except for Italy. However, we see that the UK is about in the middle of the pack here, and there are other countries that have higher property prices. I do warn, though, that this measure is in some ways troubling because it's very difficult to quantify housing prices because there are many factors that go into what causes the price of housing. Not only do we see variation within countries for housing price to income ratio, but we also see a lot of variation over time. This is the same measure in the United Kingdom from 1992 to 2021. And we see through the 90s, housing prices shot up, peaking right before the housing crisis in 2007, before falling again. But in 2021, the housing price to income ratio was as it was pre-housing crisis. Finally, there's also not only variation between countries and over time, but also significant amounts of variation in housing prices within the countries. One small note is that the United Kingdom is unique in that it has 3 statistical agencies, the ONS for England and Scotland, plus the national governments for Northern Ireland. For England and Wales, plus the national governments for Scotland and Northern Ireland. Interesting with this figure from the ONS, we see in 1997 that there was a rate of about 5 to 8 times the property price to earnings ratio in parts of southern England. But in 2021, almost every local authority district throughout England and Wales had property prices to earning ratios as high. And in particular, areas around London and southern England saw ratios 12 and 24 times that of the earning ratio. So what does this all mean in the life course? Taking a step back into thinking about housing in the life course, we can think of housing as a somewhat typical trajectory through life. Although this doesn't reflect every individual's experience, most people start their housing experience living with their family or parents. At a certain point, when they enter adulthood, they will move out, oftentimes to attend university or to have a smaller individual living, before eventually finding a co-residing cohabitation where they reside with a partner in a shared space. Finally, it's oftentimes the case that many of these couples will move to additional housing in which they plan to have family or further children. However, there are potential barriers that exist with people leaving the parental home, with being able to find a co-residential partner, or for that co-residential partner to find the type of housing that they need or want to have a family. These barriers are generally associated with residential mobility in the literature, and they can be structural. It can be due to a lack of housing, a limited local selection. There can be a housing tenure mismatch where the housing available doesn't match the type of housing that the local community needs. Or it can be that where the housing exists, the employment opportunities don't. It can be economic. It could be that the housing available is simply unaffordable. In particular, after the housing crisis in the United Kingdom, we see a rise in restricted access to mortgage and increasingly high down payments required. And finally, the barriers could also be personal. It could be that individuals can't find partners. It's that they don't leave the parental home because of care responsibilities or the need to cost share with their larger family. Or it can also just be due to ties to the local community that make them so they don't want to leave their local area. In particular, I will be looking at the final part of the housing transition in the life course. I'll be looking at co-residential partners and how they deal with the type of housing necessary to form their family and have additional children. So this leads to the question, what kind of housing is needed to have another child? There is not a lot of available literature looking particularly at life course and housing in fertility studies, but using other literature that synthesizes the type of housing that people look for when looking into residential mobility, I have summarized it as housing needs to be adequate, it needs to be stable, and it needs to be affordable. Adequate housing in particular has a lot to do with housing norms. And what kind of housing is adequate changes across countries, within countries, and over time. This type of housing norms have a lot to do with space. It's not only in just the square meters necessary, but who can share bedrooms and bathrooms? Are children at a certain age allowed to be with the same sex sibling inside a bedroom, or do they need their own space? But it also stretches to further areas, including neighborhood amenities, the most common of these being schooling or childcare, but also access to playgrounds and green space and gardens, which individuals highly rate for the upbringing of children. And finally, particularly in the United Kingdom, but not exclusively, there are strong norms towards homeownership. Homeownership is seen as stable housing. So this leads to the second point. Not only does the housing space need to be adequate, but it needs to be stable. Another way of saying this is how can we guarantee that this house will remain a home? Particularly zooming in on the United Kingdom, housing regulations largely determine whether or which type of housing is viewed as stable. Private rent in particular is seen as unstable because renter rights are relatively low, rent hikes are very common, and renovation evictions are a common occurrence in which the landlord will use the threat of renovations or actual renovations to remove renters. Additionally, the third type of housing available in the United Kingdom is social housing. Social housing is seen as more stable in general. However, the stock of social housing has greatly decreased throughout the years due to policy implemented in the Thatcher administration, which allowed renters to purchase their social housing, and that social housing building has not kept up with the demand. Finally, the third part is that housing must be affordable. In this study, I will actually later introduce that I'm looking particularly at rent and mortgage payments, which is what most people first think about when they think about affordable housing. But housing, in particular homeownership, can also be seen as a form of investment, investment in space and stability, but also a financial investment in the future. As already previously mentioned, it can be due to mortgage access or down payments. Then there's also the supply side to this. It's how much income does the household earn to be able to afford larger or more adequate spaces. And the last missing piece to this is intergenerational support or wealth and help from parents or inheriting of households. To finish this theoretical part, it means that in general, when families are thinking about having their first child or having additional children, and that the house is not adequate, stable, or affordable, they have essentially three options. They can move, they can give up on finding such a house and just simply move forward with their fertility plans, or they can give up on having another child. Is there any comments or questions? All right, let's move forward then. So my research in particular links to the cost of housing. The cost of housing competes with the cost of childbearing and child rearing. This cost is mitigated through the adequacy, stability, and return on investment of housing. This leads to my research questions. My research questions are first, how does household level housing expenditure associate with the likelihood of having another child? Does this relationship differ by parity or birth order? Does the type of housing influence this relationship? And does the employment situation of the couple alter the association? To answer this question, I used two surveys from the United Kingdom, the BHPS and the UK HLS, which have been synthesized so that I have a consistent sample over the last 30 years. They're samples from all 4 constituent countries of the United Kingdom, and I select only co-residential couples in which the woman is 18 to 45. There are no parents in the household. This is due to the fact that we want to make sure we're capturing individuals that have started this transition to adulthood, but also we want to make sure that the cost of the housing directly is bared by those who are making the fertility decisions. And finally, I only use different sex couples because I look at particularly the woman's employment. My sample includes just over 75,000 observations and a little over 13,000 couples. I see 6,649 live births, which are split between first, second, and third birth. The numbers or the percentages after each parity is how many people in that risk group I observe having that child. We can see that just over a third experience first and second birth, and just slightly over 15% have a third child. On the right, I have show my sample by women's age, starting at age 18 to age 45, and we can see the number of couples within the sample increases greatly until the age of 30, until it planes out a little bit and slightly decreases as couples leave my sample after their third child. Particularly, when we look at our sample, not only in the number of couples, but the type of housing that exists and the type of housing that exists over time, we see a really interesting pattern where in the housing crisis, the number of couples that are in private rent and the number of couples who are homeowners greatly changes. And this does not change after the end of the housing crisis. These shares stay particularly consistent. So after the start of the housing crisis, around 20% of all couples in the sample are in private rent, and less than 70% are now homeowners. While interestingly, the number in social rent remains relatively consistent across all time periods. Another interesting thing is when we look at this by age, it could be assumed that simply that more young people are renting before they have the opportunity to move into housing. But we see with those who are under 29 in 2013 to 2020, about 34.8% of those in private rent are under the age of 29. Of all homeowners in that period are under the age of 29, and about 15% are over the age of 30. Before the housing crisis in 2000 to 2007, those over the age of 30 were only 5% of the total sample. So not only are we seeing across it, but we're actually seeing more older people staying in private rent. This is important because an article that came out last year looking at the type of housing and the transition to parenthood in the United Kingdom showed that there is a changing relationship in the relationship between entry to parenthood and the type of housing. That private rent was the least likely for individuals to transition to parenthood, and homeownership is the most likely, but homeownership has become weaker throughout time. So to explore housing expenditure, I use the following explanatory variable, which is simply a ratio of net housing costs over net household income. Net housing costs are rent and mortgage payments, including principal payments, minus any housing benefit over net household income, which includes all forms of income from any source, minus any deductions, plus any benefits except for the housing benefit. So this means that my ratio of housing expenditure goes from 0 to 1. And we can see in this chart here, on the I have split each bar into deciles, with each bar containing 10% of those housing expenditures. On the x-axis, the numbers there signify the lower bound of those bars. So you can see the first bar is 10 or 0 to 10%, 10 to 20%, 20 to 30%, and so on. And the y-axis is the proportion of people in that decile by each subgroup. What's very interesting is we see a strong left skew, which we could assume, and that through parities, we see that actually as people transition to higher risk births, they spend slightly less, and the skew moves more towards the left, with individuals spending slightly less on housing as they're at higher risk. However, when we take the same housing expenditure and decompose it by home ownership type, we see significant differences between those who own their home, those in private rent, and those in social rent. Homeowners have a distribution that looks somewhat similar to what we saw in the breaking down by parity. But when we look at those in private rent, the distribution shifts to the right, and those in private rent are paying significantly more for their housing as a portion of their income than those who are homeowners. On the other side of this, we see that those in social rent, generally because of the low cost of social rent and the number of benefits they receive, spend a relatively low amount of their income on housing. When we further decompose this by couples' employment constellation, we see again that the distribution varies significantly by who in the couple is working. When they are both employed, we see a distribution somewhat similar to what we saw with homeowners and by breaking down by parity. However, when both are unemployed, we see again this very left-leaning distribution with people spending a very low amount. This is largely to do because of the means testing social welfare benefits in the United Kingdom. When people are outside of the labor market, they receive more housing benefit. But interestingly, when one member of the couple is not employed, whether the woman is inactive, she is unemployed, or the woman is employed and the man is not, we see a rightward shift in the distribution with the household spending more of their money on housing. Finally, when we look at this through our 4 different time periods, the 90s, the pre-recession 2000s, the recession 2000s, and the post-recession 2000s, we see a rightward shift through time, with households spending a higher percentage of their net household income on housing through time. This is true across all 3 housing types, but is particularly dramatic in private rent. For those in the room, this is just for private rent here. This private rent shifts greatly to the right, and particularly starting in the housing crisis in 2008, those in private rent are spending a significant larger proportion of their household income on housing. Does anyone have any questions before we move forward?
So you selected only co-residential couples. That
Correct.
means couples who are just about to start a family but do not have a flat together and a house together are excluded.
That's correct.
Do you tell something in the analysis how restricted the sample is then because of this, or how selected your sample is? Because you started with the introduction with the total fertility rate. So I thought that we can connect the two together. So the impact of the housing expansion and total fertility rate, but I think that a large proportion of those who contribute to the TFR are missing in your analysis.
That's correct. So this, just to clarify, I am not connecting this to TFR. The TFR in the beginning was just to have an overall view of what's happening in the UK. I will only looking at the propensity for first, second, and third birth. But there are, of course, children born that are in higher parity orders or born to couples that are not co-residing, or individuals that are non-partnered. All right. So finally, moving forward to the analysis, in order to see if there is a relationship between housing costs and the propensity to have first, second, and third birth, I use a multi-level discrete time hazard model with individual and regional level random effects. The regional level is the local authority district. If you can remember back to our beautiful chart from the ONS of England and Wales, those were local authority districts. So it's a fairly small but not very granular scale. Our outcome variable is live birth, first, second, or third. These are modeled separately. Because it's a discrete time hazard model, we use a clock. For the clock at the parity 1, it's the risk, or it's years since the woman's age 18. And for parity 2 and 3, it's years since the last child. Our main explanatory variable is the housing expenditure. And we look at the mediating factors of housing type, couples employment, and period. I also control for age and age squared of the woman, plus education, and if there is immigrant background. And I use the available cross-sectional survey weights from the BHPS and UK HLS. To look at our results, we see, interestingly, a pattern emerge that varies by parity. For those at risk at first birth, there seems to be a pseudo-linear positive relationship in which the more that the household is spending on housing, the higher likelihood they have of having their first child. However, for second birth, inverse U-shaped curve emerges, where around 20 to 30% of the housing, of the income going to housing is the highest, and then it starts to go down after this. For parity 3, we unfortunately have very small predicted probabilities and no strong, clear pattern emerges. However, I'd like to note this is largely likely to do because there are many people in the sample who are not intending to have their third birth, who are still in the sample, giving us, unfortunately, not super great results for third birth. Moving forward, I will just look at the results for first and second birth. So when we break these results down by housing type, interestingly, we see this same pattern emerge for those who are homeowners, that first birth has a positive relationship and second birth has a inverse U-shaped curve, although the inverse U-shaped curve is much less dramatic than it is with the entire sample. However, this is not the case for those in private rent. For first birth, it appears that there is actually a negative relationship with the more the individuals are spending on first birth or spending on housing expenditure, the lower likelihood they have at first birth. And while there is a slight U-shaped curve, when I run my regression lines, it comes out as nearly flat. For social housing, we again see this slightly positive relationship, although I'd like to note in social housing for those spending over 30% of their housing expenditure or spending more than 30% are almost no one in the sample because of the nature of social housing itself. And for second birth, it's hard to see any particular pattern, although for the lower levels, above 0 to 10%, and 10 to 20%, we see a slightly positive relationship. Moving forward, when we look at the sample by couples' employment status, what's really interesting and emerges is that for situations in which both the man and the woman are in active paid employment, we see a positive relationship for both first and second birth. The slope is slightly less for second birth than first birth, but we do not see any evidence of this inverse U-shaped curve for the second birth. On the other hand, when we look at couples in which the woman isn't active,
Si mise nuovamente in moto, grossi goccioloni iniziarono a cadere.
When we look at the woman is inactive, we actually see a very interesting inverse U-shaped curve emerge for both first and second birth. Just to clarify, woman being inactive means that she is not participating in the labor force and is distinct from unemployed. What's particularly interesting is that when we look at the distribution of these two groups from parity 1, listed in the first row, to parity 2, we see that after the first birth, fewer couples are in the situation where both members are employed, but more couples are in a situation in which the woman has left the labor force and is most likely committing full-time to raising children. This helps clarify why, when we don't differentiate the sample by employment type, we might see this positive relationship for first birth and this inverse U-shaped curve for second birth. For other employment types, when the woman is unemployed, we see this somewhat negative relationship with the more that a household spends, the lower likelihood they have of having a child. And when both couples are unemployed, in the fourth box here, we see an interesting inverse U-shaped curve for first birth, but both unemployed is highly correlated to those living in social housing. Finally, when we look at our results across our 4 time periods, we again see this somewhat similar pattern emerging with first birth, where there's a slightly positive relationship. The exception being that pre-recession 2000s, which is an interesting time in the UK where we started to see the UK go from a low level of fertility going upwards. And we see this inverse U-shaped curve roughly appear in for second birth. These results are a little more noisy and hard to interpret, but we can generally say that it doesn't appear that there's been strong changes in the nature of the relationship over time. So just to summarize what I just said, it appears that housing expenditure and fertility is parity specific. For parity 1, there is a positive relationship, and for parity 2, there is an inverse U-shaped relationship, which starts to decline around 30% of income going to housing. Those in private rent appear to have a negative relationship, with the more they spend, the less likely they are to have a child. For dual earner households, this relationship is positive across parity 1 and 2. When the woman is outside the labor force, we again see this inverse U-shaped curve emerge for both parity 1 and parity 2. And when the woman is unemployed, we see a negative relationship for both parities. So what can we conclude from this? Well, the first is that when we look at our entire sample, there is a distinct relationship for first and second birth with the relationship between housing expenditure and fertility. However, when looking at the entire sample, what there exists is there's some hidden compositional changes between parity 1 and parity 2. Additionally, we see that the housing crisis in the United Kingdom corresponded to change in the composition and housing expenditure of different couples. We see that more couples are in private rent, and the amount they're spending on rent as a proportion of their household income greatly increased. We also note that private rent costs are negatively related to the likelihood of having another child. This naturally means that if more individuals are in rent, and they're spending more money on rent, that there is a societal-wide lower propensity to have children for these groups. We also see that the employment constellation of the couple really matters, with single earner households less likely to have another child when housing costs get high. Again, we see this compositional change with our second birth more likely to have more single earner households. And finally, the amount a household spends on housing has increased over time. So what we don't see in my results is the distribution, but through time, more groups are spending more money on housing. However, it doesn't appear that the actual nature of this relationship has changed just because the composition has changed. There are a few limitations. First, as I noted, we do not know who is not intending to have additional children. So there could be child-free couples living there. There could be couples who are just simply stopping at first birth. Additionally, we cannot measure who has a relatively low proportion of housing expenditure, but do not pursue having another child because the cost of residential mobility or getting adequate, stable, affordable housing is just simply too high, so they change their fertility behavior. And the third one is we have limited socioeconomic status background, and we really don't know who had help with housing from the outside. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And if you have any comments and questions, I'm excited for them.